Okay, folks, I just wanted to reiterate one more time on this that the Walker Business Connections is coming up, and you still have a chance to register for the career day. And if you register, and I've said this again, if you register, I will give you 3 bonus points on the coming tests. It will take about a week or so for Veronica to send me the spreadsheet, but I would very much like you to take this opportunity, no matter where you are, if you're still a junior or a exiting senior, however you want to call it. It's a great experience, and I would like to give you some motivation to go to it. So please, you can find this information on the website at businesscareers.appstate.edu. It's a great source of information, and even the workshop panels to me are outstanding, because you can do those even without registration, and some of the things like how to go about a virtual interview, what is your strength, the future in internship, 10 things employers don't want to hear. I mean, wouldn't you like to know that before you do an interview? Women in leadership, how to work a virtual career fair. All of these things are just outstanding chances that you have, and it comes with the cost of admission, folks. You're not charged for this. It's just a service that the Peacock or the Walker Business College gives. And as I've said before, I haven't worked anywhere that devotes itself to its students like App does. So once again, I'm just kind of urging that on you, and I hope you have a chance to take advantage of the opportunity. Okay, so like I said, it'll probably take a couple of weeks for that spreadsheet to catch up with me, but it'll be added to the next test grade. Okay, so let us move on, and we're going to finish with channel conflict, okay? And so where we're going to end is we're going to finish our discussion about the sources of conflict, and I want to talk about one of the last sources of conflict, and that is the concept of the gray market. Now, the gray market is not counterfeiting, all right? The gray market is not counterfeiting. Counterfeiting is the selling of fake goods. In other words, they are manufactured to look like another branded piece of merchandising, but it's not, all right? The gray market is the sale of authorized branded products through unauthorized channels. And so an example I give of this is when I worked in Lafayette, there was a partner of ours, a school called Fatima, that really liked buying things from us. It made it easier for them, and we were on their approved vendors. And at that time in the 80s, they used to like to buy Commodore 64s for their students. And so they would want to buy 10 Commodore 64s, and we didn't, we still supported the 64. We had sold them before, but the margins were just, I mean, there's no way that in the 80s you could compete against even the Walmarts of those times. However, they wanted to buy from us. So what we did was we had a Houston supplier, and we would buy 10 of them, and we'd mark them up 10%, and they would buy them from us. And that would be an example of a gray market thing. And, was it illegal or unethical or immoral? It depends on which side of the fence you're sitting. The thing about the gray markets is that if you're going to find a victim, the victim is the supplier, all right? The supplier would be considered the victim in this kind of scenario. And the truth is, quite honestly, is that they may not consider themselves to be a victim at all right? Counterfeiting happens, the gray market happens usually from 3 usual suppliers. They tend to be authorized distributors or dealers who often come from other markets who pursue those particular channels. They can be called what are called professional arbitrageurs. Arbiters, what they'll do is is they will go into let's say they buy things into their market, all right? And so an example is that there's certain iPhones that the Chinese don't sell, that they're marketed for the United States only. And what they will do is that they will buy these, and there will be wholesalers in Taiwan, and they will buy these in substantial numbers, and then they'll ship them right back to China and have them sold through the Chinese market, all right? Or they may be professional traders who live near market borders, and they can transport lower priced goods to sell at a higher price market. And so an example of this is when I lived in Mississippi, on the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, the prices of liquor was substantially lower. Surprise. So you would find in cities like Slidell, which are right on the border of Mississippi, that you would have one or two gentlemen who I might know of that would drive into Louisiana, buy the liquor, and then guess what? You know, when you're under a certain age, you still have a chance to drink a beer or two, okay? So that would be an example of a gray market. So what brings about gray markets? Well, two things are. One of them is substantial differences in price structures, all right? And so different channel members would be given different prices. And so what happens is that one channel would actually over-order to an excess to get a substantial discount. And then that excess they would sell that to an unauthorized distributor in some other location, so those individuals could be able to sell. It would give them an opportunity. If I am a dealer or a retailer of a product and I simply can't make the standard that it takes to sell those given products, I could have a deal with another distributor like we had in Houston so that you could still sell those goods, even though we're not an authorized dealer, all right? The other is just economic fundamentals. The development of emerging markets, the liberalization of the trade. It means that there's brand equity in certain brands that simply aren't available in certain locations. And because of that, it means that those places could open stores even without the substantial assets it would take for a manufacturer. And without, you know, any other way, just think of any country in the third world that suddenly opens up to, let's say, cell phone service, and now all of a sudden there is an increase in the need for smartphones such as Apple and those kind of things. And so that would be another example as well. Well, the difficulty with gray markets is that there's no one to chase, and there's no motivation from the suppliers to try to crack this down. Well, why? Well, you know, they might have the legal recourse to limit the proliferation, but they may not want to, all right? You know, if the product is in a mature market and there's very little service that's required to sell that particular good, then perhaps there's not going to be a reason for the gray market to succeed. And the truth is that manufacturers very often look the other way. They can insist on having some kind of substantial agreement with the retailers and demand that the sale of those goods, that the people who sell them play ball. But the truth is that there is no financial reason to do that, because the cost of enforcement can be very high, especially when you're trying to chase down or coming to grips with a particular a particular wholesaler or retailer who does substantially good business with you. Do you really want to crack down on those individuals from their sales? And so the enforcement comes with high cost and very low benefits. What do you prove by taking a retailer and putting them out of business because they're selling in the gray market? The truth is very little, all right? And so you might actually find that suppliers have a kind of a positive disposition to the gray market. Remember, if the supplier is going to be the victim and the supplier doesn't care, well then really, you know, and the truth is, let's face it, we're all consumers. We all want to be able to buy the things that we wish. And if there is no barrier other than in the supplier's mindset, then do I really care who I buy it from? And this is, gray markets have become much more difficult to deal with, especially with the advent of the omni-channel. I mean, where do you draw the line? I don't know, okay? And so there is an increase in market coverage, so the supplier's doing better. You know, you're basically can say, hey, you know, I'm really trying. I mean, it's really tough, but you know, what can I do about gray markets? And so you can have the air of respectability without the cost, if that makes any sense. And then finally, what you can do is there's a little pressure on authorized dealers to work harder, all right? I told you about this particular situation that I had, and although it wasn't a gray market that I was dealing with, the store on the outside of Lafayette, Louisiana was selling Mitsubishi televisions out of a distributing contract with Mitsubishi of Canada, which was totally outside of our bailiwick. And this is an example of a gray market sale. Even worse, because they were authorized dealers, but the authorization came from Canada versus the United States. And there was very little that we could do other than what most people do, is that we try to sell another brand, or we try to avoid the possibilities of free riding. Now, in a mature market like this, there are limitations to free riding, so you don't necessarily have those issues to deal with. So, yes, gray markets create conflict, all right? Is it as much conflict? Is it the great conflict that we concern ourselves about? Not necessarily. Okay, just realize it exists, and as I said before, they're always generally in active, developed economies. Authorized channels generally don't cut themselves down, and as long as the customer can buy anything from anywhere, as long as the price is low, generally consumers don't care. Okay? All right, so winding down the concept of conflicts, it's important to understand that when there are balanced relationships, where there are many alternatives in given channels, balanced relationships tend to create less conflict because there's much more of a willingness to give and take, all right? Well, of course, we all know that we're intolerant to coercive tactics. However, because very rarely do you have balanced relationships, you always have the difficulty of having conflict one way or another. And some of the things that will create conflict in the relationships is adding a mass merchandiser. And so if you're selling things through a given series of channels, if I'm a retailer that is receiving goods and I happen to be a small store in Boone and I'm doing well, then all of a sudden Walmart starts selling them, I'm in a world of hurt. All right, that definitely creates a conflict. You know, adding a new dealer to any dealer's territory is bad, and especially also if you have a very profitable product line and those are withdrawn. And so how do dealers cope with it? Well, generally dealers just passively accept it, all right? It's just the way we're going to do business and we can't do about it. The other thing that we might do is we might pound that table vigorously and say, we're not gonna stand for this kind of thing. We're not gonna do that. But the truth is that sometimes you don't have that possibility. You might take that line and relegate it to a lower priority, or you may even find another line to replace it. And that happens quite a bit. And the last thing that you can do is you can threaten to stop selling them, or if it's so important, you can band together with other dealers and try to combat that. And so I talked about in the 50s when the automobile manufacturers in the United States decided they were going to sell direct to people. And the dealerships The only thing that they could do was they banded together in the Automobile Dealership Association, and they forced the auto manufacturers to back down on it. I don't see how it could have lasted anyway. Folks, 60% of the profit in any automobile dealership is service. And so the service comes solely from the individual for those dealerships to sell cars that can be serviced on. By the way, when we talk about retailing and we talk about franchising, there's that whole story about how Tesla has decided to sell that ought to be an interesting conversation, okay? And so balanced relationships tend to be differentiated as many alternatives in the channel, but perceived unfairness is the greatest negative impact on any channel member's cooperation and flexibility. Perceived unfairness, the single most important thing, because when you're perceived as being unfair, it not only is in a bad way, but it's in a mega bad way. It aggravates the situation beyond what just the mere negative effects, okay? And so, along with this concept of unfairness, how do you cope with conflict? And this is where all of this has been leading this whole chapter. It is basically, is there a way of dealing with conflict? And the answer is yes. And the way that you deal with conflicts is the concept that's known as institutionalization, all right? And so dealing with this relationship poison that is known as unfairness, what you have to do is put into place in your organizations ways of, in essence, fighting against this. And this is the concept of these conflict resolution strategies. And the way that you not only forestall conflict, but make it a constructive thing is through institutionalization. So we're going to go through each one of these one at a time. And then the first thing that we'll do is we'll come up with a discussion of what institutionalization is, okay? And so institutionalization is when policies are part of the environment. Institutionalized policies are part of the environment. They are unquestioned and even taken for granted. In other words, it is part of the DNA structure of the company that you're working for, all right? You can demand institutionalized policies and be put in from the start, but the important thing to understand is that it is hand in glove with working in the organization. That's what the institutionalization is. It's part of the overall environment of the corporation. And so these four approaches at resolving conflict, any one of these four are ways in which organizations hope to find ways of solving differences. And so the first way is through information-intensive mechanisms. The willful sharing of information in as much implicitness as possible. Being implicit in understanding and sharing information can be very risky, but no success comes without risk. It also means that you may have to divulge sensitive information, that you may have to devote resources to communication and communicating in a positive manner. But when you share information, you create trust. And so how do you do that? How do you institutionalize this information exchange? Well, the first way is that both sides are in a joint membership in a trade association. And so you can use an association, a group, as a way of coming up with what would be standard measures of conduct. And so what this would mean is that Walmart, or let's just say the manufacturer of let's say outdoor equipment and foot sloggers, I'll use that example again, both are common members of a trade association of outdoor equipment. And so that would give them a common neutral ground to be able to talk and discuss about what they consider to be best practices in that organization, in that field. The next is, and this is a big step, and you see this in large organizations, is the exchange of personnel. And so channel members exchange channel members. And what we have is the cross-pollination of ideas and thoughts. They're transmitted to each other. And it is a marvelous way not only to create better exchanges of ideas, but to have an understanding of what the other individual's job is. And many times, that helps to stamp out conflict before it begins. So if you were to go to Bentonville, Arkansas, there is a department area in there which has all Procter & Gamble employees. And the Procter & Gamble employees exchange dialogue with Walmart. Walmart shares to Procter & Gamble their plans, their designs for the fall. They give them an idea of where their future is going so that Procter & Gamble can see it. And by the very same thing, I believe it's Dayton where Procter & Gamble is, maybe Cincinnati, I can't remember. Anyway, Procter & Gamble's central headquarters, there is a Walmart division there. And Procter & Gamble talks about their future and their future products, and Walmart helps them, or they define together ultimately where that future is. And when you do that kind of investment, it goes a long way to damping down conflict. So the second is a third-party mechanism. Now, a third party is exactly as it sounds. It is a separate body between the two channel members who are in some form of conflict. They are an arbitrary individual or corporation that are not involved in the channel system, but hopefully what they can do is that they can find some way of coming up with a negotiated agreement. Mediators provide a fresh view on the situation. They may think of opportunities that the other two members, because they're locked into their own thought patterns, that the other two can't, okay? They may be able to find the underlying causes of this conflict and may be able to find some way of juggling an agreement so that there's a win-win situation, all right? They allow both sides to save face because the third party allows them to find a third way to come up with a solution, and mediators are very successful, 60 to 80%, okay? So neither party is obligated to accept the recommendation of the mediator, but just because they're in the process of mediation, hopefully what it does is it creates a positive atmosphere. Now, the mediator takes no part in the decision. In arbitration, the third party makes the decision. Both parties state in advance, no matter what the decision is, that they will honor whatever the arbitrator comes up with. And so there's two types. There's what's called voluntary arbitration, and this is where the parties voluntarily submit that they will allow this third party to make the choice. And then in compulsory arbitration, the parties are required by law to submit their dispute to a third party. Generally in arbitration is much like a court case, in that the arbitrator generally is a judge. The individuals will listen to the disputes of both parties, and then they'll make a choice. Now, in compulsory arbitration, generally that is focused only on those industries that are considered to be important to the national interest. And so railroads are one of those things. Air traffic controllers are one of those things, where strikes would be disadvantage to the nation in general, that in a time of emergency, it would be very damaging for those to be down. And so those are what compulsory arbitration. Voluntary arbitration sometimes is when organizations come to and have simply no other choice. So, baseball. In the 60s, up until 1968, baseball players, and I certainly do not want to say that they had the history of indentured servitude, but in their working lives, in essence, that's what it was. If a baseball player was signed by a team, then they could not play at any other team. They had to play for that team, and they had to take the money that the team was willing to give them. In 1968, a baseball player played for the St. Louis Cardinals by the name of Curt Flood, willingly gave up his career, in the height of his career as an all-star player, and spent the next 4 years suing baseball, and in 1972 won the rights for free agency. Now, it was still limited. You did find some success in free agency. Bobby Grich, Don Rice are some of the players that I can name right off. But it really was still held back. In the 1992 baseball players strike, the baseball players struck for 100 games to get this right, to be able to open up salaries and into true free agency, which meant that they're not even bound by the contract. Well, they didn't win anything, all right, no matter how much they, and in frustration at the very last, the one thing that they offered or asked for from the judge or from the baseball owners is the right to third-party arbitration. And the baseball owners, who were just as in bad shape as the players were, said, yes, we'll agree to that. Now, does anybody got an idea of how the baseball players made off since then? Got an idea? They made out like bandits, all right? Because the prices were artificially deflated anyway by the baseball owners. And the judges started signing up, quadruple, quintuple of even what the baseball players were asking for. Guys were making $200,000 one year. All of a sudden, we're making $3.5 million overnight because the judges were planning it that way. And from the 1990s to 2010, baseball players had some of the highest salaries in the world in any single sports industry. From 2011, though, arbitration has gone in the way of the baseball owners. However, this is an example of third-party arbitration. And the truth is it saved baseball, because there was no way that baseball was not going to continue unless there was some willingness to give up. And the baseball owners got hurt at the beginning, and so now it's balanced itself out, and it became a way that conflict was resolved between the owners and players ad infinitum. Okay, so third-party mechanism, it works if it has to, all right? And so it's kind of interesting if you ever go into what's called mediation arbitration agreement, and this is where you have a mediator come up, and the mediator tries to settle the disputes, and the two sides basically say, look, we're not going with it. And so in a mediation arbitration situation, the arbitrator says, okay, I'm going to make my decision, and I'm going to put it in a sealed envelope, and I'm going to give it to you guys, and y'all tell me whether or not you go along, you're going to come up with an agreement. And so the two sides know that there's going to be an agreement one way or another. And so in the mediation arbitration, what happens is that if your party still can't abide, they open the envelope and they accept whatever the arbitrator does, and they abide by the decision, okay? Now, it works, all right? You know, there is no perfection in conflict other than some way to settle disputes. And one of the difficulties, especially in any conflict, is the concept of winners and losers, and that's what gets caught up. There are no winners if conflict doesn't get resolved, all right? And so the best of all is if members find some way to settle their disputes internally without the prospect of outside intervention, but third party serves as a safety net for dealing with conflict after it climbs too high, okay? And that's the key. Third parties, once we're in a shooting war, third parties have a way of at least resolving the conflict with as little damage as possible to the relationship. Because here's the thing in the long run, folks. Success does not happen unless there's cooperation. And one way or another, we have to guide each other back to the table and solve our disputes. And so remember that, okay? Third party arbitration, or mediation. The next is building relational norms inside the organizations. And so once again, that thing of me about relational norms, as I talked about, relational norms are all built within the organization itself. And what that also means is that there's an expectation of behavior that's shared by all of the members. And although we have institutionalized policies, of course, with Appalachian State, far beyond that, the members of Appalachian State have firmly believed in inclusivity and also in the long run sustainability. Those are things that are inherent in every faculty member that's ever been here. And of course, we state those things as self-evident when we talk about those things, but that's an example of what relational norms are. Now, what makes a relational norm successful? One of the things is it has to be flexible. We have to be able to change given certain circumstances without breaking our firm commitment to the goals themselves, okay? What it also means is is that no policies, written or otherwise, can be so firm, or let's just say so specific in minute details that in essence, even the most minutest break cause a fracture in everything. The difficulty with it, everything that isn't mandatory is forbidden, does not give flexibility to humans who sometimes make mistakes, all right? You know, there needs to be all sharing of information and everyone works for a mutual benefit, not just a one-sided one. Now, as I said before, management can't decide one day to just suddenly create relational norms. They have to emerge from our interactions, who we are as an individual, and constitute what's happening inside the marketing channels. And so relational norms, folks, happen with the people that you hire for your jobs, all right? It is the expectation that comes in with every employee in an organization. Implicit and explicit, spoken and not spoken, all right? Relational norms is, once again, as I've said, it's part of your DNA. It's part of who you are. And when you build with relational norms from the beginning, you make a much more solvent and coherent organization. And then the last, which certainly should be least surprise, is having incentives. And so using reward power. And so one of the examples that they give, and what I mean by this is, there have been trade publications that have been written about this for 2 decades or even more. So there's a type of good, the convenience goods. If you think of the categories of goods, there's a subcategory that's called fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG. Okay, and that product category is those goods that are sold on impulse, on interest, and they can be as unique items as candy, or they could be like small flashlights, nail clippers, those kind of things, fast-moving consumer goods that are sold quickly. And manufacturers will pump enormous amounts of money into creating promotions and point of sale. These are these point of sale things that you'll have in any Dollar General, or you'll have like in any supermarket, that display these things for them to buy on their way out, okay? And manufacturers will get very upset that they're not mounting them, even though they're paying these promotional money to do it. And that they're saying is they're not fulfilling their promised share of the promotional allowance. And so this is an example. And so one of the ways that manufacturers, that there has been a way of dealing with this, is quite simply giving them a higher piece of the pie. Giving them a higher margin for perhaps, say, the first 3 months. And so that there's an incentive to be able to push these goods through. They want to be able to know that along with a strong communication of what they wish, is that they want to incentivize or provide economic rewards for organizations who fulfill their agreements. There's an old saying by Robert Heinlein, who's a great science fiction writer, who said, never appeal to a person's better nature because they may not have one. Instead, appeal to their pocketbook. And that's true, all right? Now, they generally do well, okay, generally work well, okay, when you appeal to that economic self-interest, but they must do more than get a better price or a higher allowance. They have to be visible or easy for, they can be easy for competitors to match, but there has to be a portfolio of elements, okay? It can't just simply be one deal that the competitors can say, well, I'll take up with that, all right? And so you need to have this flexibility. You have to be able to compensate for lower volume with higher commissions. You can do things by making it easier to sell. You can establish a sales agent to work that area with them as well. And it's just, once again, it requires an investment, all right? The agents have to respond in very indirect, risk-oriented arguments, okay? You should try to convince them that, yes, this is not an unpredictable thing you're doing, but you're doing with well-established, forecasted products, and you want them along for the success. And of course, the difficulty when we talk about reward power or incentives, and in essence, is that it becomes addictive, all right? There's an expectation of incentives, but that's the way the world turns, okay? So the last thing to talk about is conflict and how does it affect the omni-channel. Now, does the very nature of the omni-channel make it more likely to have conflict or less likely? Well, in the omni-channel, because of the need to create a seamless interface and interaction between all of the channel members, the conflict is more likely to be functional. In other words, with the marketplace members that Amazon or eBay or Walmart has, the stricter, the tighter organizational structure that they have between them, in essence, creates a greater probability that the conflict is functional and not manifest, all right? It requires a greater coordination, so it means that Walmart And it means that Amazon and eBay are going to work towards coordination and teamwork because it's necessary for them in order to achieve success. And so in the omni-channel, the conflict is less, or it's going to be functional. Now the multi-channel is maybe more difficult and more dysfunctional because of the greater concern in cannibalization and free riding. With separate offerings and separate channels, the chances that one channel member is going to rob from another is going to be, in essence, a less likely chance for functional conflict and more of a destructive, or what I would say, manifest conflict, okay? The independence and commitment diminish because the parties have little motive to synchronize their offerings. And for this reason, especially, it is more likely that even though you're selling the same product, because they're siloed, the channel partners in each one of those silos is going to be more concerned about their little fiefdom than the overall success of the system itself. And so if we're going to look at this last little slide, we can see that the omni-channel increases commitment, increases functional conflict, and increases the interdependence, while the multi-channel, by its nature, decreases commitment. The multi-channel decreases interdependence, and the likelihood of functional conflict decreases the likelihood of functional conflict. Okay, and so probably in a two-word answer, it's very simple. There is that you'd be able to say omni-channels decrease conflict, and multi-channels increase the probability. Excuse me. Let me use the right words. Okay. We're done with chapter 3. I'll have these slides up tonight. I won't leave before I've got this uploaded. Just a little mention about the test now. I've decided that to make it easier for all of you, what I'm going to do is I will start the test at 11 on Thursday and allow you any time from 11 in the morning till midnight to take the test. All right. I think flexibility would be a good thing. And so it'll still be 90 minutes to take the test. It'll still be 30 questions, multiple guess, 5 essay questions, 8 points apiece. But you have a greater flexibility of when you'll take the test, okay? Okay, folks, so if you have any questions or whatever, please email me. Good luck on the test. I will probably not be in the office on Thursday, but certainly I'll be checking my emails, okay? So y'all take care and good luck, all right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you.